and then he stuck them on the others. So it just doesn't fill you with confidence for doing anything else. There you go. There you go. There you go. I feel better now. It's done it.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Yeah, talk about virtual cure that.
Yeah. Well, this is going well. Well, predictably the weather has stopped proceedings, at least for now. I'm hoping it might dry up this afternoon and I'll give it a bit more of a going over, but certainly a hell of a lot cleaner than she was. But in the meantime, all of you people who turn your nose up at the 2-bucket method, here's why it's a good idea. So that's the nice clean water I've been using, and this, that's the rinse bucket. Yeah. Wash bucket, rinse bucket. Nice. So it's a week later, and I'm shortly going to be on my way to go and collect the XC60. It's had the torque converter replaced, so we're going to see how that goes. We found a few other issues as well, which I'll go into a little bit more detail about later on in the video. And I'll also be giving you a driving impression of the 267,000 mile V70 D5 that I got to drive as well, which was kind of cool. I've never driven a car with that much mileage on before, and I've got quite attached to it actually. So the next update will probably be from the services on the M1. Right, so some more lumens, still rubbish. Right, so it is nearly 6 o'clock. I've done my usual rubbish job of actually getting organised and setting out when I plan to, and I'm now going to make my way over there. So next stop will be hopefully the services on the M1 if they're not shut. Well, I've just pulled over for a cup of coffee at the services on 15A. Got ready to put it into the location that I'm used to sticking it to on a P2, and it's disaster because look, this one's got the telephone. There's no cup holder there. I'm going to get the GoPro set up in a second. I've not decided whether I'm going to film a POV or whether I'm just going to mount the camera in the usual sort of place. So I'm going to get that set up, drink my coffee, and then continue on to Horton. What's going on? Let's see if she starts. Go.
At the end of the road, turn right, then sharp.
Right. Onwards to Horton Cars then. So I'm on the A43 heading towards Bicester. and I know I probably said that wrong, so lots of people are going to go, boo! So I'm on the A43, I'm heading back towards Horton Cars, about 33 miles to go, and I thought it was a good opportunity to talk to you about how I've got on with the loan car I've been given, which is this 267,000 mile P2 Volvo V70. Now it's quite interesting because in the great British public perception, I do sometimes think that once a car gets beyond much over 100,000 miles, people automatically assume that they're going to drop to bits and the rubbish got rid of. And I think a car like this that's clocked up this kind of mileage with maintenance just goes to show that that's all a bit of a fallacy, really, and that if you do look after a car, you can get decent mileage out of them. This obviously, given its mileage, there are certain things that aren't quite optimal. The suspension is quite baggy, the bushes are quite worn, the steering is a bit vague, but perhaps no more so than in most other P2s I've driven, to be honest with you, because it was never a strong point when they were new. But for the most part, given its mileage, it drives very well. It's very smooth, it's very quiet. The fuel economy out of this is fantastic. Driving back last week, I managed to get 60 miles to the gallon. 60 miles to the gallon out of a diesel automatic. I think that's brilliant. This is the earlier version of the engine, which is 163 brake horsepower, no DPF, and it's probably the more trouble-free of the earlier P2 diesels that you can get. The later 185 brake horsepower engines aren't quite as reliable, and they're certainly not as economical, although they are obviously a little bit more powerful. But like I say, I'm really surprised how good the gearbox is given the mileage. I mean, you hear horror stories about P2s and automatic gearboxes, doing 120,000 miles at best, and then, park the car in the corner, get rid of it and get a new one. Well, this is a prime example and case of how that's not true. Graham at Horton Cars, who's loaned me this, said that it came into them having done 199,000 miles, and it's just done so well. Obviously, the exterior is quite careworn. There's plenty of battle scars, bumps and scrapes, as you would expect for this sort of mileage. The driver's seat bolster's pretty worn. The windscreen is like sandpaper, and the interior is showing a few signs of degradation. But to be honest with you, I've got inside cars that have done just over 100,000 miles that have looked worse inside, and this is still absolutely supremely comfortable and had absolutely no problem at all hoovering up the mileage on the way here. Because I'm a little bit of a loon, I couldn't resist when I got home giving it a good clean. It got valeted, snow foamed, I've hoovered the inside out. I've even wound up finishing it with a new set of windscreen wipers, because I happened to have a set from when I had a V70 T5 a few years ago, sat boxed at home, and I just thought it'd be a shame not to put them on this, particularly given the fact that we've had less than ideal weather, shall we say, in the last week or so. It just drives so nice. Given the mileage and the condition, I must admit, I've driven this a lot more cautiously than I probably do my XC60. But as a result of that, I've spent more time hanging out in the slow lane, keeping my distance, generally keeping the car at just 60 or slightly below, which is where it seems to be happiest. And it's fine. It just scoots along. And the thing I love, and to be honest with you, that's probably more what the subject of this video is about, rather than I'm no road tester, I'm no hub nut, I can't sort of rattle off information about cars whilst I'm driving particularly well, but I can ramble on and talk to a camera. But what I love about cars like these, particularly when they get to this sort of price point, is that they give you something which you can't get at a dealership. Arguably, you can't even get when a car is a few years old. To expressionless. There's nothing on it at all. But cars like this, at this age, in this mileage, in this condition, have character. And it's just something that endears them to me in a way that something nearly new just doesn't. And you sort of drive along and you think to yourself, well, who's the fool? You know, the people that are spending £300, £400 a month on a PCP for their nearly new car, or something like this. I mean, this car, with decent maintenance and looked after, will probably do another 100,000 miles quite easily. Quite easily. And the other joy for me with cars like cars in this sort of condition is getting them and improving them. That's why when I got home I couldn't resist giving it a clean. I couldn't resist getting the Hoover out. I couldn't resist throwing a set of wiper blades on it because I knew I got them. I dreamt of if this was mine and I took it home and I just bought it cheap off eBay, I know what I'm like. Within a week it would have had wishbones, it would have had 4 new tyres that were A-rated in the wet, I'd have done the brakes, I'd probably serviced the gearbox again, I'd probably considered replacing the windscreen. I'd have spent a small fortune just revitalising it, breathing a bit of life back into it. I'd have got the machine polisher out and got all the paint as good as I could get it. I wouldn't have necessarily rushed out and resprayed it, but there's a certain... I suppose if you're not a car person, it's difficult to... weird car to a person, it's difficult to explain, but for me, the joy of a car like this, as well as the character, is being able to buy something, especially if it's a little bit neglected but not fully far gone, and just revitalise it and give it a little bit more life and make it look a little bit smarter and make it look loved. One of the best cars I had for that was a 2003 Volvo S40 1800, which I bought as a stopgap, really. When I bought my first house, I had to sell the nearly new car I had at the time to help put a deposit down. And I bought this 1500 quid S40, sorry, and thoroughly expected to be fed up with it, miserable. It was a needs must car. And you know something, I absolutely loved it. Because again, it had character. It got nearly 100,000 miles on it when I bought it. It was inexpensive and it cleaned up beautifully. Absolutely beautiful. And those sorts of slightly unloved diamonds in the rough type cars are the ones that really appeal to me. Now this is probably at the extreme end of the scale for many people. I would say to you, unless you are reasonably committed to maintenance, I wouldn't rush out and buy yourself a car with 267,000 miles on the clock. And maybe if you're rattling up and down the motorway every day, perhaps you are going to need more sort of reliability. But for car people, being able to get hold of things like this that are still reasonably comfortable, reasonably safe, usable every day, is all the more appealing. V70 Symphony. It's just so smooth. I can't believe how nice the gearbox is. I really can't. I'll have to ask Graham what they've done to it, because they must have done some work to the gearbox on this car to be so good at this mileage. The gearbox in this car is much better than the gearbox that I had in my V70 T5. That used to be very snatchy from second to third gear, and I always suspected that it wasn't quite right. It also used to clunk when you turned
After
left.
800 yards,
This,
cross the roundabout and take the second exit, A43.
Uh-oh, engine service required. See, I've been saying nice things about it, and now...
After 800 yards, cross the roundabout and take the second exit, A43.
Yeah, that has gone into a bit of a limbo, that has. Oh well. That's That's probably because I just gave it some... I'm sorry, it's because I gave it some 5-cylinder Symphony, whole thing. Engine service required. Then check engine lights.
Cross the roundabout and take the second exit.
Yeah, I went to the trouble of cleaning this. They're never going to know by the time I get there.
Right.
Because the weather's just rubbish. Look at it. Blowing a gale, it's chucking it down. One thing I will say for buying a car of this sort of mileage, or running a car of this sort of mileage, things like the windscreen do take a bit of a hammering. I don't know if this is the original, I'm guessing it is because it's still got the Volvo SRS airbag stickers and labels down the bottom, but it is like sandpaper at 267,000 miles. Visibility in cars is one of those things I'm very, very particular about. There's a number of areas I don't scrimp on when it comes to cars. Tyres is one, the brakes is another, visibility is another. So if this was mine, I'd probably consider putting a new windscreen in it just for better visibility, because it is quite scratched, but it's good enough. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what sort of state the XC60 is in when I go and fetch it. It's pretty major surgery changing a torque converter in a car, and Graham has pre-warned me that the car might misbehave a little bit initially. There's these things have got computer-controlled systems for operating solenoids and everything else. Changing the torque converter seems to upset and can upset the system in the car. So I may need to allow it a period of time for it to settle down. Yeah, I mean, I've completed 206 miles in this now, probably a little bit more than that because I filled it up when I picked it up from the garage, but it's just, again, I'm kind of...
After 500 yards,
I'm very
cross the
attached.
roundabout and take the second exit, A4421.
I've found myself very attached to this little car, well, not little car, but very attached to this car generally. It's just got something about it. It's quite sweet. Makes me smile.
Cross the roundabout and take the second exit.
So I find a lot of modern cars aren't particularly likeable. The really funny thing, of course, is that people were saying the same thing about these years ago. And there's that standard thing of, it's not a proper XYZ.
After 200 yards, go right on the roundabout and take the first exit, Bicester Road.
But it does make me wonder whether some of the...
Go right on the roundabout and take the first exit.
Some of the SUVs and other vehicles that we lament now, whether we will look on them more favourably as they get older, as they age. I think we will. I'll get out after that though. Steady. See, she's still quite feisty. But yeah, like I say, this, for its age and mileage, really does drive rather well, I think. It's been far from a nightmare to rattle along in. And it's kind of made me want to get an old P2 as a project. It might not be a bad idea. Petrol P2s are getting monstrously expensive at the moment because the vast majority of them are compliant with ULEZ regulations.
At the end of the road, turn left,
cars
Vane Road.
that a few years ago would have fetched not a great deal of money at all are now fetching absolutely ridiculous amounts of dollar because they're being flogged to people in London. So a 2.4 NA automatic is worth a fortune now, whereas a couple of years ago you'd been looking
Turn left.
You'd be looking to get more than 1,500 quid for them. I've seen them for sale for £7,000, which is just ludicrous, really, given what they are. But earlier D5 diesels, because they aren't ULEZ
At the end of the road, turn left, B4011. Turn left.
Earlier diesels earlier of these, you are going to have to be prepared to spend on them. They are reliable, but there's a whole host of things you do need to do to them to look after them. Wishbones, suspension mounts, they're quite heavy on the front, so they do get through shock absorbers and things like that pretty quickly. Maintenance on the automatic gearboxes is pretty much essential. And then there's the belts. You don't ever want to skimp on the belts. The auxiliary belt, the cam belt, make sure they're all done. Don't be tempted necessarily to rush out and change the water pump. A lot of people do. They'll fit an aftermarket one as part of a kit. The original Asen water pumps that are on these are very, very good. They'll easily last the sort of mileage that this does. So maybe do the water pump and get an original at this kind of mileage, but certainly if you're getting up to the first belt change interval, I really wouldn't bother, because you'll very, very, very rarely have an issue with them. Other than that, like I say, front end suspension, they're quite heavy on, but for the rest, oh, and there is one more thing with P2s, which is the rear handbrake shoes. The handbrake is probably the worst aspect of the P2, I think, in general. It's horrible, it rolls backwards when you apply it on a hill, it's not great, and it's a set of shoes inside the rear discs. And what can happen is those shoes can delaminate, and when they delaminate, they can get caught up inside the hub at the back, and there's a little sacrificial block that is supposed to stop the rear wheel from locking up. And if that happens, you're in a bit of a mess. So you do buy one of these used and you're doing a full set of discs and pads, I would strongly recommend you change the rear shoes as well and do them fairly regularly. It's also a good idea, if you can, just to run the car a couple of clicks on the handbrake, just to scrub any rust off on the inside of the rear, sort of the inside of those discs where those shoes sit as well. And then other than that, it's just all the standard things you'd expect, really. If you buy an earlier engine like this, you're less likely to have problems with DPFs, and you've got all the standard diesel problems, injectors, EGR valves, etc, etc, etc. And there's videos out there which will cover that in far more depth than I probably can. Because this is a off-the-cuff drive, record, talk nonsense video, pretty much.
After 500 yards, bear right, B4011.
3 and a bit miles to go. Whee! It feels happy because it's nearly home. I don't think it's been used to being out of Buckinghamshire. It's probably been sat very confused. Nearly home now. And I can collect my thing.
Bear right.
How many people go steaming straight onto that bend by mistake? Unsuitable for heavy goods vehicles. Looks like a rally stage, that one does. So anyway, I'm nearly there, and I'm certainly going to spare you the horror of watching me try and park this enormous bus. So, I'll say thank you very much for watching. Please do consider subscribing before you go, and I'll see you in a future video. Cheerio! So I've picked it up. So far so good. I've just stopped at the Tesco's in Bicester just to have a bit of a breather and have something to eat. And I've now got 98 miles to go home. So we'll see how things go. Drive and talk, Dave. Drive and talk, and eventually you'll get where you need to be. Thing at the moment is to keep an eye out for the rest of the great British public, who of course all drive
Cross
like
the roundabout
dickheads.
and take the second exit, A40.
Next roundabout in 3/4 of a mile, so no point trying to say anything now. Being out-dragged by a Kia. Oh look, there's somebody in an Audi who can't look beyond the bumper of the car that's in front of him. Seriously, do they send you people to a special school to drive like complete killers?